back to the podcast of Wednesday's Child. You're listening to Debbie Watson. I'm the founder of Wednesday's Child. We're a not-for-profit eating disorder organisation seeking to help people affected or impacted by eating disorders. I'm joined again today by Sarah Parker, the wonderful Sarah Parker, therapist who specialises in supporting people in their recovery journey with eating disorders. Hi, Sarah, how are you today?
Hi, Debbie. I'm really good, and it's a real joy to be here with you again today.
It's always lovely to have you. So I've dropped this one on you as a theme because I've had the utter kind of awakening of reading this really lovely book that a friend was telling me about earlier this week. And like everybody does in this world of Amazon, you go straight on and click, that one's in my basket. And the book is called The Let Them Theory. And, you know, I can go into many reasons why I think this book is great and it covers many topics. And it's certainly not a eating disorder recovery tool as such. But there was one particular passage that stood out for me. And I thought this is a brilliant area for you and I to dig into in an episode. And this is about recovery. And the aspect of this book is an element where the author describes it as the more you rescue, the more they sink. And it's about helping someone who is struggling. Now, I thought we would dig into that today and look about whose responsibility is recovery. How do we ensure that everybody is showing up to the party for eating disorder recovery? And at what point is it right, wrong, or indifferent to say, I can't do this on behalf of the person I love? And you immediately said, yep, you can kind of see a lot in that personally, and also in what your professional world shows up for you. So kick me off. What does that leave you thinking about how we support someone in recovery?
And I think, you know, there's such depth to this conversation, Debbie. I think both from somebody who lived with anorexia, and somebody who works as a therapist now with people with eating disorders, I think that we want people to get better, and that's human nature, particularly when they're our loved ones. You know, we care for them, we worry about them, we want them to get better. And so we fall into a trap of trying to do everything. And, you know, I was saying to you, as somebody with an eating disorder, I would give my dad ultimate responsibility. And because he was afraid, you know, ultimately of me dying, he would take that responsibility and do everything. Now, that dynamic meant that I learned not to do anything and not to take any responsibility. And he learned that he had to take responsibility. Now, there is absolutely no blame in that. He was just doing the best he could. I was just doing the best I could. But what it didn't teach me was that I had more in me than I knew. It didn't teach me to take risks. It didn't teach me to try things out. It didn't teach me to do things that felt really difficult. And I think ultimately, the relationship that we had meant that my eating disorder, sadly, was perhaps never going to get better whilst he was alive, because I was so reliant on him. And I guess there was a part of me that thought, if I start to get better, he won't do all of this stuff, and I can't.
That's so interesting. So you're almost saying there, and correct me if I've kind of misinterpreted that, but when you say, you know, there's a part of me that recognizes if I'd got better, he wouldn't be there, he wouldn't be doing that role, he wouldn't be performing that. So that's about the identity shift that you perceive would have to happen. Something about validation of need, something about so long as this continues, the world recognizes me as a sick person. My dad keeps showing up to support me. Is that right?
Absolutely. I had really, sadly, trapped him into a role of doing everything for me. And my biggest fear was, well, if I'm no longer unwell, what if he doesn't see that he needs to do that? And I had developed this huge fear of the world around me because I hadn't engaged in it for such a long time. He'd done everything. Yeah, and this was as an adult, Debbie. This wasn't me as a child. And I think we can easily get caught in those traps, and it's very difficult to get out of them. And I think it's the same within therapy as well. We can go to therapy and we can show up at therapy and we can want, the amount of people, myself included in the past, who want a magic wand. They don't, they don't want it. That's harsh. But people fear doing the hard stuff. They fear the feelings, understandably, that come with change and recovery. They fear feeling the anxiety and that fear and the uncertainty that comes with change. So, people avoid those fears and want somebody else to get them to recovery almost without having to go through that.
So is that unique to eating disorders, that level of fear of change and fear of what might come?
I think it's human nature in general that we don't like change. Humans are kind of pre-programmed to like familiarity, to prefer familiarity, even if that familiarity is not helpful or even not safe. Familiarity means that we know what's happening. That little caveman brain that we have knows what time the tiger's going to come across the front of the cave, so we don't go out at that time. So we're pre-programmed to prefer familiarity to stay alive. Now, that doesn't count in our world today in the same way, but we still have that old brain that will drive us towards familiarity. So I think it's across the board. But I think particularly often with the rigid black and white thinking styles that we see in eating disorders, I think it often feels much bigger and kind of more severe. But I don't think it's only in eating disorders.
So you will regularly, presumably, see people who you feel show up for therapy, but don't really don't show up fully and submersively to do the homework, do the hard yards, go through it. They are there because, and as we've mentioned on Wednesday's chart before, there are kind of points in your recovery journey where you say, I will do this, I'm going to do this, I intend to do this. And in some ways it feels like a box ticked to have, oh, I've made an appointment with Sarah Parker. I'm going to sit in that chair. I'm going to have therapy. But there's a massive difference between really and truly attending, immersing yourself in therapy, isn't there?
Oh, hugely. And I think if I'm honest, most people will come to therapy because they want change. But quite quickly, when they start the process of therapy, they start to feel the feelings that come with change and then pull back a bit. Some people pull back entirely and don't bother coming back because it's don't bother's a harsh term. Don't feel able to come back because it's difficult. And some people will keep coming.
Sorry to interrupt, but is that in part because, so I know in the unpicking of some of my eating disorder journey and the origins of it, some of the very nature of why it began, how it began, was about suppression of those feelings and thoughts, wherein the food control and behaviors allowed me to dumb the feelings and fears and all those kind of things that were going on in my headspace then. So you're then taking somebody in that world where actually, oh no, hold on a second, I'm using that tool, that illness, I'm using that to keep these feelings suppressed. Now I've made this appointment with this person, I've got to go and sit and attend these sessions, and oh my God, I'm having to pull out the stuff that hurts like hell.
Yes, and I think we have to be honest that for most, if not everyone, an eating disorder has a purpose. And we're asking somebody to give something up, or they're coming in order to give something up or change something that has had purpose. It's given them something, because if it didn't give them something, they wouldn't keep doing it.
Let's
The
talk about that
habit wouldn't
purpose
fill.
then. So go on and encapsulate that for me. Give me a kind of some sample of your type of therapy clients who you feel, what kind of purpose in their head is it serving? Or indeed, do you identify for yourself what purpose, perhaps your relationship with your dad, what purpose was it serving?
Well, I think originally for me, the purpose of it, whilst I didn't know it when it started, it was about self-esteem. It was about weight loss. I'd been overweight as a child and I'd been teased for that. And here I was in a body that was no longer going to be criticized for being overweight. So in that respect, it was protective, but it was also protective because I had, through my teenage years, struggled to to think about moving beyond the safety of my family home. I
Mm.
felt safe there. Nobody teased me, nobody criticized me. So moving into adulthood meant that I had to leave that behind. So becoming ill and looking physically more childlike was almost a justification for staying in the safety of my family home. But we'll see so many different reasons. It may be that, people want others to know that they're suffering. And particularly with anorexia, in a body that looks physically very unwell, there is no doubt that somebody's suffering. So, to let the world know that somebody's suffering, it has a really important purpose. Sometimes it's about punishing people. Sometimes, as you say, it's about not having to feel the feelings that have felt so uncomfortable for us. You know, we when we're focused on food and weight, and when we are thinking about that all of the time, we're not having to think about the distress of the past, traumas of the past. So it can have multiple purposes, all of which, unless we find something different to help the person navigate that with, they're not going to feel confident in giving up the eating disorder.
Wow. So when you are confronted with a situation where you feel the person that you're seeking to support is getting a almost unhelpful level of support from family members or whatever, how do you navigate that? How do you help them understand that this may not be an aid to
Yeah.
their recovery
Yeah.
journey?
I think it's gently, because what we know is people are just doing the best they can with the situation that
Yeah.
they see. And it's scary. So I talk often about teamwork. You know, it can't be one person doing everything. It has to be a team. And the person with the eating disorder, if they can surround themselves with a team, but always remembering that they're leading that team. It's about that person is looking to make the changes, and they're the only person actually that can physically do the changing. Nobody else can do it for them, much as we often see people wanting them to. The person with the eating disorder has to do the changing. However, they don't have to do it alone. So it's looking at what kind of support do we need from other people? What are the helpful things to say? What are the helpful things that people can bring to this team that will support that person to do what they need to do? But it is about being clear that the person with the eating disorder is the only person that can do the doing. However, they don't need to do it alone. So it's checking out, often in therapy, we'll be looking at the teamwork and the relationship within therapy. And if the therapist is doing more work than the client, then we've got to ask a question: what's happening here? Where's the balance gone wrong? Because, we can really want somebody to do it, and we can do all the helping that we can do, but that doesn't necessarily empower the person that's suffering to make the changes themselves. Yeah, as I did, I handed it away. Um, and sometimes I think, Debbie, for some people, for a brief period of time, we need to hand away responsibility in order to then be strong enough to take it back. So there is that aspect to it. But actually, when we take it back, it's about saying, how am I going to hold this responsibility? How am I going to ask people for help without actually trying to make them do it for me? And I think it's painful for carers, for friends, for family, because to watch somebody struggling and feel helpless is really difficult. But I think even if you're trying to do something that is rescuing that person, for want of a better word, you're still not helping them to get better. You're trying to make them better. And actually, what we're looking at is empowering the person to say, I don't have to do this on my own, but this is for me to do. And if I do it, I'm gonna feel like I've succeeded in something. And we want that person to feel the benefits of success, not to say, oh, they did it for me, to say, I did this. Yeah, I had support, but I did this.
It's really interesting. So one of the analogies that this author, Mel Robbins, uses in the book, and the child she refers to is her child and is not somebody that's had an eating disorder, but she talks about how her child started suffering severe anxiety, was staying in her own bedroom at night, convinced that she could hear noises and that it was frightening. And eventually, unable to appease the child, her mum then decided to make a bed down the side of the kind of marital bed for the child to come and, you know, get into when she felt uncomfortable. But of course, what happens is then the child assumes, well, you're rescuing me every night, so I'll just get into bed at your side every night. And she said it was the worst thing I could ever have done, because it just convinced her she really did have something to be afraid of. I understood her fear, I recognized her fear, and I was going to be there to support her. And I'd even created a mechanism to save her from the real fear.
Yeah.
But of course, there was nothing to fear. And it wasn't until she eventually realized actually the only way out of this was to say there genuinely is nothing to fear. There will not be a bed for you at the side of my bed. You must become comfortable with the uncomfortable of being in your own room and finding your way to navigating that path yourself. And of course, then child is able to do that. Child becomes stronger. Child becomes more confident. Child feels like it's a victory that she has managed to work her way through it. A strange analogy in some respects when you think about it in the context of eating disorder recovery, but I could immediately read it as somebody who has been through an eating disorder and lent on my family in the hope that they would rescue me.
Yes.
And who felt very fearful and wanted effectively the equivalent of the bed by the side, you know. But you've got to navigate the path yourself somewhat.
You have. And I think that that's one of the hardest things to do, I guess, as a parent, to watch their child go through the pain that they believe you can save them from if you're effectively sleeping in the bed next to them. But I think that it's about short term versus long term. And in the short term, that will ease the symptoms. But in the long term, it will prolong them. It will keep them going, because the child then doesn't learn, okay, I'm okay here. Doesn't learn that it can sit with those feelings and come through the night and get up the next day and still be there. So we're looking, particularly in recovery from an eating disorder, at the long term. We're looking at, yes, the short term can be really painful for everybody. But in the long term, what we're looking at is promoting independence and confidence and autonomy and empowering the person to live life without an eating disorder, but with people around them. And so in the long term, that short-term pain, we've got to see it's for a reason. It's not just because somebody's been punitive, it's because in the long term, it's helping people to see, I've got in me what I need to get through this with my team around me, but nobody can do it for me. And actually, I don't need people to do it for me, because look, I'm doing it. That's what we're looking at doing in change and recovery from anything really, but particularly eating disorders. Because I think when somebody is very unwell, the tendency is to want to make them better.
Yeah, sure.
But I think we've got
I
to
think
help them.
the other thing I think is challenging with eating disorders, because there's the argument about, you know, when are you ready for recovery? And I certainly felt for myself, you can't wait to be ready for recovery with an
No.
eating disorder. You just need to start when it's itchy, scratchy, when it hurts like hell, when it's really uncomfortable, when it's the worst possible time in the world, when you're full of grief, when you've got a change of a job, a change of relationship, where you least feel like you want to do it. Get started. just get started. Because if you wait to feel ready, you will never do it.
You'll be waiting forever. You're right, Debbie. And I think, there'll always be a reason not to do it. There'll always be a reason not to do it if we look hard enough, for one. But I think that, and one of the things that people often talk about, and it, if I'm honest, it really grates with me when people talk about motivation, because motivation is a thought process that will come and go. We can't rely on it. It won't be there all the time. So if we're waiting to feel motivated, we might get moments of motivation and then it's gone. We've got to look at commitment, because commitment is about action, and we can decide to act even if motivation isn't there. So it's easier to take action to make changes if we feel motivated, but we can still take action to make those changes, even if our thought process isn't very helpful to us. So one of the things that when I was in recovery was that every morning I would get up and I would commit to a new day of working towards change and recovery. And what that meant was I was going to do X, Y, and Z. And my commitment to that, even if I didn't really feel like doing it because my thoughts were saying, I'm tired or I am not feeling this, I could still take those actions. So I think we've got to look at commitment and commitment to act. We are the only ones who can act.
That's so interesting, isn't it? We really are kind of, we are the ones in the driving seat of our own recovery. And, as much as anybody else in the passenger seat can reach out and change gear and shout stop, it's the person in the driving seat that's got to do the hard work.
And the amazing thing is, Debbie, that when we are in the driving seat, we get to choose the destination. Nobody else chooses our destination. So when we're driving it, recovery looks however we want it to look, need it to look, hope for it to look. We get to make all the decisions. And it's swapping that sense of, I can't take this responsibility. It's too much for me to, okay, I'm going to take this on. And I'm going to make small but measured and consistent choices to drive to wherever I want to get to. And that'll change along the way. It's like sat nav. You have the first turning and then you decide, and then you see the next turning and the next turning. But when we are in the driving seat, even if we have our family as passengers, we get to choose our destination and they come along with us.
So before we wrap then today, tell me, if there's somebody out there listening to this and thinking, yeah, I think I have the ability to commit, but I don't feel motivated, or I recognize some of what Sarah and Debbie have talked about today. I do think I'm making my parent, my carer, my spouse complicit in putting the responsibility on them for recovery. Can you give any kind of really helpful, easy to think through tip for helping them engage in that first step?
Yeah, I think the first step is seeing what's happening. So they've already taken the first step.
Yeah.
And I would say be really honest, talk to your loved ones about the fact that you realize that you're giving them responsibility, and you're maybe scared about them not holding that responsibility, but talk to them about how you can share it. Use your voice. Try not to kind of hide away and say, this is what I'm doing, but I can't tell anyone. Be open, share it and say, I don't want you to just step away, but I do want us to talk about how we can work through this together so that the balance can change a little bit. But, I am scared, and so please support me with that fear. It's bringing people on board in a really open and honest way and saying, I know I've got to do this, and I still need your help.
As you say, it's about creating that team, but the team dynamics don't need to necessarily be the same from one person to another, do they? It's kind of what works for me.
Yeah, and the team size will be different. It's about designing your own team that can bring you what you need to get to where you want to get to.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. I think, it's really helpful, and it's another brilliant episode that tees us up nicely for when we have our next parent carer support group in a few weeks' time. So that's the middle of June. And hopefully plenty of you that will have listened to this episode might be inclined to join us for that session as we talk more about different tools and approaches and tactics that can come into play when you're supporting the recovery journey of someone that you love and care for. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's been a pleasure to spend some time with you again. Really appreciate it. You're always so insightful, and I'm really very grateful, because I think there's something special about speaking to a therapist who not only knows her onions and really kind of has been there professionally, but you're not afraid, are you, to bring in your personal journey and say, I recognise where I was.
Yeah, there is no shame in what any of us are doing or where any of us have been. We're doing the best we can to get through this tricky life. There is no shame, and it's about saying, here I am, this is me, and this is what I need now.
No shame, no judgment. We're all human over here in the world of Wednesday's Child.
We sure are.
Thank you so much for listening to the latest episode of the Wednesday's Child podcast. We will see you for another one very soon.